Here's my audience.
Where do you mostly see Latin? Is it in an old museum, or is it in those dusty old history books that your history teacher still firmly believes that is good for the curriculum? Well, technically, you should be seeing Latin everywhere. History books, the beautiful modern history books, English books, even that personal book you're reading. We're even speaking a little bit right now. On October 16th, in the interview with Shannon Johnson, she explained how 60% of English is composed of Latin roots. That is over half of our language that is composed of Latin roots, which is why everyone should learn Latin because it is beneficial. Today, I'm going to try to persuade you into learning Latin. I will be using the English language, the Romance languages, and modern science as my examples. For I'm credible enough to do this because of the interview with Shannon Johnson and because I take her Latin class. As stated previously, 60% of our language is 60% of our language is composed of Latin roots. This means that Latin can help people learn English for the first time or even expand your vocabulary. Latin is fundamental Latin is fundamental for the English part of the ACT and SAT. This is because Shanna Johnson says that Latin students, according to many studies, consistently outperform others on the SAT, ACT, and even the LSAT. She then goes on to explain how she helped her college professor with a program called SciTag. They had 20 middle schoolers take the SAT, then take Latin for 3 weeks, then take the SAT again. The second time they took the SAT, Shanna explains how their scores had gone up nearly 20 points across the board. Latin can even help with English sentences. In 2025, Lemming M says that Latin helps us better understand what a word means because, once again, 60% of our language is composed of Latin roots. Would be from Latinus Scientificus also says this does not mean that we instantly recognize every descendant of the Indo-European. With several millennia of isolated evolution, Germanic and Italic branches had become mutually unintelligible by the early Common Era, at which point we can identify a Latin word that has crept into German as a foreign presence. This is where Latin begins its influence on English. What Would-Be was trying to say is that Latin is not an automatic cheat tool to learn every single language out there, but instead, because of all the languages becoming mutually unintelligible over time with the help of Latin, that has helped influence English. Not only does Latin help with English, but also helps with other languages. In all languages, you have to decline nouns. Fun, right? What noun declining is when you change the ending of a noun by replacing it with a new stem to change the grammar case, gender, or even the person. Now, unfortunately, there are no grammar cases in French, Italian, and Spanish, but there is still noun declining because of genders. Team GC in 2025 says that all nouns are gendered in all languages. Latin just only helps us understand or memorize the genders for each noun. Spelling can be different though. For example, in the interview with Shanna Johnson, she says that Latin and Spanish are very similar in grammar structure, and a significant amount of vocab comes directly from Latin. However, in my experience, my Latin learning interfered with Spanish vocabulary acquisition. I took Latin first, so quite often while studying Spanish, I could recall the Latin word and not the Spanish vocab word. For example, the word for book in Latin is liber, whereas the word for book in Spanish is libro. But she then goes on to explain that knowing the Latin roots for each that identifying the Latin roots in an unfamiliar language can help you identify what a word means right away. Learning Latin is great for languages, don't get me wrong, but it's also awesome for modern science. Ending with my third main point, science. Science is full of problem solving and Latin roots. So which is why it's beneficial to learn Latin for science. The article, Benefits of Latin, supports the idea that Latin helps strengthen problem-solving abilities because when you're trying to translate something in Latin, there are multiple steps to trying to figure out what a sentence means. Problem-solving is important in science because of all the studies and math scientists have to do. Science has to do. Benefits of teaching Greek and Latin words also explain how Latin is a building block language. Because it has helped build our science terminology. With that being my final point, I will move on to the conclusion. In conclusion, Latin is helpful not only in English, but also in learning Romantic languages and in science. So the next time you don't know what cardiovascular disease means, you don't need to ask your science teacher because you learned Latin and you already know what cardio means. Which is why everyone should learn Latin. My audience once again.